Hi, welcome back to ICE. In this video, we're going to take a look at programming for the mobile web. And there are a number of code examples that these slides will often refer to. And in the lectures, we will talk further about these code examples. But let me introduce to you a couple of key ideas when we want to program for the mobile web. You may have heard of this idea of responsive websites or device responsive websites, which are websites that would adapt to the client device. In other words, if the client is a browser running on a mobile device, the website shown will be different from if the website was viewed with a browser on a desktop device, for instance. So what we want to do, if we wanted to respond to the device or we want to have a website that adapts to the device, we first need to detect what the device is or what the browser is on that device. And once we have done the detection, then we want to provide the suitable version of the website to the user according to the detected browser or device. So that's the basic idea of device responsive websites. Let's look at how we might detect the browser on the client side. You can have two things running on the client side. One is JavaScript code and the other is some CSS style sheets. And let's look at first the JavaScript code. So on the client side, there's a variable in JavaScript called navigator.userAgent. So there's a built-in JavaScript object called navigator that has properties that relate to the browser itself, or the navigator is just another name for the browser. So navigator.userAgent refers to a variable called userAgent belonging to the object navigator that contains information about the current browser. So if the JavaScript code was running in the browser and within that code you want to find out some information about the browser in which the code itself is running, then you can refer to the browser or information about the what's called the user agent using this variable that belongs to the navigator object. So navigator.userAgent, that will return an object with information about the user agent. So the client that is requesting web pages is called the user agent, right, in the web protocol convention. So if you look at this string, what's the value of user agent or the value of navigator.userAgent? What's the value of this variable that belongs to the navigator object? Well, if you are on an iPhone, it will look something like that. So that part in red is the value of the agent variable, is the value of navigator.userAgent on the iPhone. Right? So you notice that you have this user agent attribute with the value as this entire string, Mozilla /5.0. So it tells you something about the core of the browser, Mozilla core, and then the iPhone, the CPU, the type of iOS even on the phone itself, and then some Apple libraries that have been used to create the browser and so on. Right? So this is actually using the Safari browser on the iPhone, and the iPhone was running OS 8.1. But if you run the same JavaScript code and you try and find out what the value of navigator.userAgent is on the MacBook, right? So you're running the JavaScript code on MacBook, and if you look at the value of navigator.userAgent, you get that part in green, right? So you get the attribute user agent, and the value is Macintosh, Intel Mac OS X 10.10.0. So that was a version of the Mac OS X that the Safari browser was running on, and this is the Safari browser in which the JavaScript code was running. So you can make use of this to adapt the JavaScript code basically. So if your JavaScript code wants to show different things or do different computations depending on whether it's an iPhone or a MacBook, for instance, you can have a variable. The index of, remember, the index of returns the occurrence of the iPhone string in agent, and if it doesn't occur, then you will return -1. So if it's not -1, that means iPhone, this string iPhone is found in the navigator.userAgent string. Right? In other words, if it's an iPhone, then it's not going to be empty, so it's going to be not -1. Or if it's an iPod, it will be not -1. Right? So this will be true, right? So it will contain the string iPhone if it's really an iPhone. It will contain the string iPod if it's really an iPod. And so if it's an iPhone or an iPod, that is, then you will write this, otherwise you write. So this is JavaScript code that writes out a string according to what type of device it is. If it's an iPhone, you will write out this, this line of code will be executed. If it's not an iPhone or it's not an iPod, you will run this bit of code here. Or you might want to apply different style sheets according to the type of device, according to the screen size, for instance. So you want to apply this style sheet mobile.css on condition that you have a device whose screen width is less than 480 pixels, and this is quite typical of smartphones of today, right? So the 4 or 5 inch smartphones will have maximum device width of 480 pixels. This is the screen width, right? So when you use this attribute media and you specify this value, it is saying that this style sheet mobile.css will only apply if you have a device whose width is less than 480 pixels. In other words, if you're on a smartphone, then this style sheet will apply. If you're on some other device which is larger, which has a screen size, like if you're on a laptop or desktop with screen or device with more than 480 pixels, that style sheet will not be applied. So of course you can have more than one rule, right, with different style sheets that apply to devices of different width, for instance. So you could use this media attribute here like this when you link to a style sheet from within a HTML document, or within a CSS rule itself, you can encapsulate all your rules within an add media rule, right? So what this rule says is that this particular rule here, so this is just a normal rule, but this rule, of course you can have this example just have one rule, but you can have more than one rules. And so this rule will only apply for screens with minimum device width 375 pixels and less than 667 pixels. So this is a CSS rule that only applies to devices whose width is between 375 pixels and 667 pixels, right? So you apply this rule. So you can have more than one rule, right? You can have many add media rules. One rule, you can have a rule that says you set the width to something else if the max device width is 180 pixels, for example. So you can have different media rules. You can have a whole bunch of media rules that applies to different screen sizes. So this is a rule that applies for device width between 375 pixels and 667 pixels. You can have a different add media rule for minimum device less than 375 pixels, for instance. So you can have add media rules like this. So in the first rule, for devices whose width is up to 374 pixels, the container width will be set to 300 pixels. For screens whose device width is between 375 pixels and 667 pixels, then you set the container width to be 480 pixels. And in the third rule, if the device width is from 668 pixels to 1000 pixels, you set the container width to be 780 pixels, right? So you can see that you can have different CSS rules that apply according to the width of the device, right? And the width of the device is a good indicator of the type of device it is, whether it's a mobile, tablet, or desktop, and so on. So this is the general form of media queries. So only screen and query is actually that part here, that specification of the parameters of the device. And certainly there are more details about this add media rules that you can use. Some information about adapting CSS rules according to the device. So you can see that you can have JavaScript code that runs differently according to the type of device it is. You can have CSS rules that would apply according to the type of device it is. You can also have adaptations on the server side. So on the server side, you can detect the type of browser or type of client it is. On the server side, you can detect what type of client or what type of browser or what type of client device it is receiving requests from. And to do that on the server side, you have a PHP code that accesses this $_server variable, accessing the key value http_user_agent, and that will give you information, the same kind of information that you would find from the navigator user agent variable. $_server http user agent is accessing the user agent information sent from the client in the request on the server side. Right? So one's client side, one's server side, not to confuse the two. And so you can adapt your behavior on the server side or send back different type of information according to whether the device is a iPhone or something else. So in this example here, on the PHP code side, it will first detect if it's an iPhone, and if it's an iPhone, so it's not false, so it's true, then send the redirect using the header PHP function call to redirect the user to the mobile version of the website. And certainly in the labs and so on, we'll come back to examples like this more. So here's an example which we will do in the lab. You'll see how this could work. And certainly there's more information about how to detect the mobile device from this GitHub website and a very elaborate discussion here. So we have only looked at examples to detect the iPhone or Android device, but there are a whole range of mobile devices that you can detect, so you can have a look there. But the similar idea applies. So you may be wondering, which do you use? So do you detect the type of browser or detect the client device in JavaScript or in CSS, or do you do it on the server side? Well, it depends on how much of adaptation you want to do, right? If you just want to adapt the behavior of some of the JavaScript code, you can just do it this way. Or if you just want to apply different style sheets according to the mobile device that you're using, you can just use either this method or this method. But if you want to redirect the user to a completely different website, a completely different subtree, if you like, of the website, then perhaps the server-side redirection is more useful. Right? Are you just adapting a bit of JavaScript code, or are you adapting the entire style that you want to have, or are you redirecting the user to a completely different website on detection of the device? But you will look at a couple of examples in the preparation for the lab exercises as well as the face-to-face lab exercises of both client-side and server-side detection. Now you may be wondering how much of content do you reuse, right? So if you think of the realestate.com.au website, there's a mobile version, m.realestate.com.au, and it's quite typical to use m instead of www. And then you have the desktop version, which is www.realestate.com.au. So across these two different versions, whether you're accessing realestate.com.au, M or the desktop version, www version, you are accessing the same database. So in that case, you're at least sharing the database, and that's very common, right? So whether you're accessing the information from the mobile device or desktop, you want to access the same database information. Well, when you're implementing some server-side.php programs like authentication scripts and so on may be shared across the mobile and non-mobile versions. Some JavaScript libraries may be reused, some HTML code and some CSS may be reused. But it is quite typical to have different style sheets for the mobile version than the desktop version, for instance. So in the labs and in the lab exercises, you'll compare a mobile pizza and a desktop pizza version. Now, there are many frameworks, and certainly you're welcome to use these frameworks in your assignment. if you're familiar with Bootstrap, PhoneGap, or jQuery Mobile, and there are many new frameworks that are emerging, right? And Google has developed new frameworks and all that. And so there are too many frameworks to cover in a one semester subject. But if you already have prior familiarity with these frameworks, you're welcome to use them. But bear in mind that many of these frameworks focus on the client side, like JavaScript, CSS, and HTML5 or HTML. So they may not deal with PHP code, for instance, and they may not support Ajax as well. Some do, some may not. So if you're using Bootstrap for the assignment, you're certainly welcome to do that, especially if you're already familiar with Bootstrap. Then you got to think about how Bootstrap can work with PHP or with Ajax if you do use Ajax. So there will be some complications there. Also, if you don't know anything about Bootstrap and you want to learn how to use Bootstrap, it might take a bit of time. So for the assignment, you don't have to use Bootstrap. You can just use normal JavaScript, CSS, and HTML and just build from the examples that you have done in the labs and lectures. But you're welcome to use these frameworks.